In this lesson, we're going to take a look at how we can transform multiple objects at once, and the options that we have available for controlling how those transformations will be applied. I've laid these switches out so that they're all at a consistent distance of 0.3 meters from the main control switch, and they're evenly spaced along that arc, or in other words, the angle between each of the dials from the main switch is equal. Now, let's say that we want to take these 4 control knobs and rotate them as a group around this main switch. The handle tool handle for each of these control knobs is currently positioned at the center of the main switch. But with these 4 objects selected, if I drag on this rotation handle, you see that only one of these knobs moves. So essentially the handle tool won't allow you to transform multiple objects at once. Only the last object to get selected will get transformed using the handle tool. To transform multiple objects at the same time in the viewport, we need to use the dedicated move, rotate or scale tools. So I'll switch to the rotate tool by tapping the R key, and we have 2 options for how this rotation will work. If I right click over the handle, we can choose whether this transformation will be applied locally or globally. If I select global control and rotate the switches, we see that they rotate around the average center point between them, or what would technically be called the centroid. And we can see this small purple dot in the center of the transform handle here, which indicates the point around which this rotation will occur. Now, to be able to rotate these dials around the main control switch, I can just tap the apostrophe key, move the handle to the center of that main switch, tap the apostrophe key again to reattach the handle, and now I can rotate these 4 dials as a group around this main control switch. If I right click again and choose local control, and then rotate again, the objects rotate around their own local pivot points. If you get a strange looking transformation at first, like I'm getting here, just deselect and reselect the objects after switching to local control. And now we see the objects are all rotating at the same rate around their local y-axis. If we take a look in the operation controls toolbar above the viewport, we have this drop down where we can choose to have a single handle for all selected objects, which is what we currently have selected, or a handle per selected object. So if we choose the handle for each selected object option, now we have a handle for each of these dials, and they're pretty large and intersecting. So I'll tap the divide key to reduce the handle size, and now we can adjust the rotation of each knob individually, but without having to reselect them. When we choose to have a handle for each selected object, then it doesn't make any difference whether we have local or global control selected. Adjusting an individual handle will only affect that specific object. We've only looked at these global and local controls with the rotate tool so far, but the same applies for each of these other transform tools. So if I switch to the scale tool, and we still have a handle per object, so we could just scale each object individually, but I'll switch to a single handle, and now we see that all the selected objects are being scaled around their own local axis at the same time. If I right click and select global control mode, then we scale all the selected objects around the centroid of the selection. And of course we can detach and move the handle, so if I do that and move it to the center of the main switch, now we can scale all the objects from the center point of the main switch. With the move tool, there's one additional option under the right click menu that we need to consider when translating objects locally, and that's this option here to translate globally in local control. So with this translate globally in local control checked, if I switch to the local control mode and reselect these 4 dials, then when I click and drag on an axis handle to move the selection, all the objects will be translated in that same direction. The local handle alignment for the selection will be based on whichever of the objects was selected last. So if I select each of these control knobs one at a time, starting from this one, then that local transform uses the axis alignment of the dial which was selected last. And if I deselect and select them in the opposite order, then the transform uses the local axis of this dial. If I right click on the handle and deselect the option to translate globally in local control, now when I click and drag on the Z-axis handle, each object is being translated along its own local Z-axis. If I quickly change the handle mode to one handle for each selected object, then you can see more easily how each of these objects are currently orientated. I'll just quickly switch back to one handle for all selected objects, and I'll just translate them again along the Z-axis, and so you can see that the objects are all moving along their own local Z-axis. We can adjust parameters for multiple nodes at once in the parameter view. So for example, with these 4 switches selected, you can see at the top of the parameter view, it says that we have 4 nodes selected. And in this drop down, we can see the names of each of those 4 nodes. If If I type 0 into the Z translate field, that will set the translation for each of these objects to 0. And you can see that they're all now sat at that 0 position in Z. And if I control middle click on the rotation label, all the rotations will be reset to 0 for each of those selected objects.